Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Smith here. We're going to be talking about the skeletal system today, and this presentation was provided by Kessler Science, which is who we use for the stations labs as well. So the essential questions we're going to answer today is number one, what is the main function of the skeletal system and how is it structured? And secondly, what are the main organs in this system? So typically in class, if we'd had paper copies of this, you would cut out the body systems template and glue them together. And then we would talk about the function and main organs and fill that in as we progress through the unit. So when we talk about a skeleton, in terms of living things anyway, there are two types of skeletons: exoskeletons and endoskeletons. Exo, as you can imagine, because of the prefix exo, means external. Exoskeletons are external skeletal systems made up of chitin and calcium carbonate that provides protection to creatures such as insects and crustacea. So, by crustacea, we're talking about things like crabs, lobsters, and yes, as you can see there, a scorpion. And insects as well don't actually have internal bones, but they have external bone-like structures, as noted, are made of mostly chitin and calcium carbonate, and those are incredibly rigid to protect their internal organs and internal parts, if you will. Mostly, when we think of skeletons, we think of endoskeletons because they are what we have. Well, we have one of those. Excuse me. An endoskeleton, and again, the prefix endo tells you it is internal or inside. It's an internal skeleton of an animal, which we call vertebrates. Vertebrates have a backbone, which is comprised of bone and cartilage. So when we talk about the skeletal system, we typically think of bones and cartilage. And then when we talk about attachment to the muscles, we think of tendons. So the primary function of the skeletal system is to give us a solid framework to kind of hold us up and give us structure. So if as you can imagine, if we didn't have a skeletal system, we would be a large pile of stuff. One of the things I always think about to compare it to is if you've seen Toy Story, I think it was in the third one, when Mr. Potato Head is trying to sneak through the window. And in the video to get back into the playground or the nursery, he gets the burrito shell, and like he has no he can't stand up straight, and he keeps falling over and things, and he's like flopping around. So that's kind of how I always, well, at least since I saw the movie, how I thought we would look if we didn't have a skeleton. But most of our organs are protected by the skeletal system, our bones, and that keeps things from slamming into our heart and our lungs, and other parts of us that otherwise, if we took a direct hit, could actually potentially kill us. It also anchors the skeletal muscles. So when we move, really what's happening is muscles that are attached to our bones shorten. And when those muscles shorten, that pulls on the muscle, or I'm sorry, pulls on the bone, and that's what allows us to have movement. So the main organs are the bones and joints. So there are five main functions of the skeletal system. First of all, we've talked about support and protect. So it supports the softer tissues like our skin and our internal organs that are kind of jelly like. It provides points of attachment for most skeletal muscles and provides protection for many of our body's internal organs. And I did forget to mention the brain as being one of those organs on the previous slide that we can clearly see there. Our skull protects the brain from trauma, which ends up, could potentially kill us. Another function of the skeletal system is movement. The skeleton works with the muscular system to allow for movement. It's also the production of blood cells. Red bone marrow inside the larger bones produces red blood cells. And then we also have white blood cells and yellow blood cells. So most people don't know about the yellow blood cells, and that's not really important to us right now in terms of having to know that. But white blood cells are our immune system. And red blood cells, as the name indicates, are the cells that are in our blood that actually give it its hue. And it's actually the hemoglobin that's attached to iron that's rusted that actually makes our blood have a red appearance. So another function is storage. The interior of the bone can store minerals like calcium and phosphorus and chemical energy such as fatty acids, and that's kind of where the yellow the yellow bone cells come in because they're actually fat storage sites. Homeostasis: bones are able to absorb, excuse me, or release calcium into the blood to maintain stable environment in the body. That's required for muscles to move. It's also required for nerves to function properly. So you wouldn't be able to move or like sense when something touches you or that sort of thing. So the skeletal system sure does a lot. So we're not going to be getting with a partner, obviously. But take a moment and see if you can name the five functions of the skeletal system. If you can't, go back in the video, look through those again, and take your time to go through those to make sure you know what the five functions are. So when we talk about an adult skeleton, we talk about 206 bones, and then those are classified into different categories. You've got long bones, which is like your femur, the tibia or the fibula, the humerus, and you've got the ulna and radius, and there's some other ones. You've got short bones, which there are lots of examples of those. And then you have irregular bones and flattened bones and sesamoid bones. And those are all just different categories of bones. And so typically what is easiest to do is to look at what is a long bone. So you look at the bones and you're like, oh yeah, that one's long and tubular. So then you look at short bones, which they're not long, but they're still kind of tubular. And then you've got irregular bones. They don't fit either one of those. And you've got flat bones. So that's actually usually third in order of classification because you can look at that and say, well, it's not long, it's not short, but it is flat. And then sesamoid bones are all kinds of weird shapes and protrusions and that sort of thing. So we talk about the skeletal system in two main divisions. You've got the axial skeletal system, or the axial portion, I should say, which are 80 bones along the axis. Axis means the midline or the main part. So this is like your chest and your head and your abdomen. And those together are 80 bones, and they protect your internal organs. They are shaded in blue if you look to the right in the image. And then the one that's shaded in red is the appendicular skeleton, and it is 126 bones of the appendages. Appendages are like your arms and legs, and the girdles, which is the girdle is the attachment point to the axial skeleton. So this is going to be your shoulder and your hip, or your pelvis. And that connects them to the axial skeleton, and that gives us support to be able to stand up, move, pick things up, etc., and gives us some flexibility. Now, when it comes to bone tissues, you've got compact bone, which makes up the dense outer layer of the bone. You can see it there in the picture. You've got spongy bone, which is found inside of bones and is lighter and less dense than compact bone, but it is because it is porous, and it literally looks like a sponge. If you look there and you look at like a sponge you wash your car with, or maybe you've got one you take a shower with, it's the same kind of appearance, or at least similar. So bone marrow is the soft connective tissue that produces blood cells found inside the pores of spongy bone. And again, refer to the image there. Then you've got the periosteum, which is a tough fibrous membrane that covers and protects bones. So joints are what hold the skeleton together and support us in our movement. And so we've got function is the range of motion or synovial, and then you've got structure, which is the material that holds the bones and joints together. You can see you got a swivel joint in your neck. You've got ellipsoidal joints in your fingers, and then you have ball and socket joints in your hips and your shoulders. You have plane joints in your feet, hinge joints in your knees, saddle joints in your wrists. So lots of different joints. So the skeletal system and muscular system work together. Conjunction means together, to allow our body to move. So muscles are attached to bones, and I mentioned this earlier, with tendons, and bones are connected to bones with ligaments. So when the muscle is contracted or shortens, the skeletal system can move, because when it shortens, it's pulling on the bone that it's attached to, and that's what allows us for movement. So what holds bones and muscles together? There's a dense layer of collagen fibers that are either ligaments, which attach bone to bone, or tendons, which attach muscle to bone. And you're going to find these in pretty much any place where you've got some kind of range of motion or movement that's possible. And it's going to vary from one to the next. So when we talk about male versus female skeleton, the most important difference is found in the pelvis. The female pelvis is wider, flatter, and more circular to facilitate childbirth. Female skeletons are not as massive, and female thoracic or rib cage is more rounded and smaller. And again, if you refer to the pictures to the right, you can see that the female hips are actually kind of opened up and more flat, and there's a much larger opening, and again for the baby to go through. So some of the diseases that we see in the skeletal system, and this is by no means all inclusive. This is just a short, simple list of some of the most common things that we deal with. Osteoporosis is one of those, and that's where you have a loss of bone tissue, particularly in elderly people. This typically happens because as cells age, they don't reproduce as frequently, and that's actually pretty complicated, and something you probably learned like the high school or collegiate level. You've got osteomalacia, which is softening of bones associated with vitamin D deficiency. One of the reasons they add vitamin D to milk and other foods that we consume regularly, and that's again to prevent that from happening. Arthritis is an inflammatory disease that damages joints and surrounding tissue. And there are different kinds of arthritis. So you've probably heard of rheumatoid arthritis, and there's different categories, and they have differing severities of symptoms and different ways that they affect different people's lives. So it's going to vary from one person to the next in terms of how they perceive or feel or experience that particular form of arthritis, depending on the individual. So, one other thing, most of you have probably had your spine checked. When you were younger, they had you bend over, and the doctor would rub their fingers down your spinal cord to make sure it was straight. Because if you've got a bend in your spinal cord, that is typically one of the conditions that is listed there is going to be scoliosis. Bone cancer is only 1% of all cancers that are found in the bone. It is also, I am told, one of the most painful types of cancer that to ever exist that you could ever have. So here's to hoping that none of us develop that. Obviously, we can have breaks, strains, fractures in varying ways. It takes 6 to 10 pounds of pressure to break an average bone, but they are flexible, so they'll bend before they'll break. It actually would take a tremendous amount of pressure to actually break a bone for the for the most part. So, can you identify the structure and main function of the skeletal system? And can you identify the main organs in the system? And I think that'll do it for now. So, I will end it here. If you have any questions, please post them below, and we will do our best, or email either Miss um, Sparks or myself, and we will get that taken care of for you. Thanks.